Right. This is a video I'm doing to talk about what is meant by natural monopoly. This is a topic that we'll cover in chapter 10 of our principles book. So I've got the cost curve drawn up here for natural monopoly, and what we can see is we start with you've got an average total cost curve that's declining, and that's the key feature here. So that's also called economies of scale in production. And what we're assuming here is that there are economies of scale in production throughout the range of quantity that's going to have to be that might possibly be demanded in the market. So you have this declining average total cost curve. And then the other thing is we do have to have a marginal cost curve that's below the average cost curve. So I've drawn it in this case to be horizontal. And then it looks like we've got the average total cost curve declining to equal at some point eventually or approach the marginal cost curve. What this might look like, and especially this average total cost curve here, could look like the average fixed cost curve that we introduced in the short run. And so that suggests that perhaps what we have in natural monopoly is some kind of a fixed cost. But that isn't exactly the best way to think about it. And in one sense, it can't be how we want to think about it. Because if these are long run cost curves, in the long run, all costs are variable. So there's no distinction between fixed and variable costs. So if we're thinking in the long run in an industry that's going to be naturally monopolistic, we can't rely on the explanation like, oh, well, there would be a fixed cost of producing this good. But there is something similar that we'd call a first unit cost. For some goods, there's a large cost that has to be incurred before the producers can produce even one unit of the good. A great example of this in the past, back in the days when you'd actually have newspapers be printed out, would be newspapers. Because if you think about it, think of all the costs that would go into a newspaper. You'd have to have all of those reporters reporting stories. You'd have to have editors editing the stories. You'd have to have people laying out all those stories on the news type, which used to be a lot harder when you didn't have computers to do that for you very easily. You had to set up the printing presses to be ready to run the copies of the daily newspaper. Oh, and you'd also have to have some people selling ads and preparing ads that would go into the newspaper. You have all of these costs that have to be incurred, and they have to be incurred whether you print out one copy of the daily paper or 500,000. So that would be a very good example of a case where you'd have a large part of the cost would have to be incurred, and they'd be incurred before you could produce even one unit of the good. Then with the newspaper, all you'd have to do is have enough ink, enough of printing ink and paper to run out those extra 500,000 copies after you have the first one ready to go. We see something like that with a similar thing with public utilities, many types of public utilities. Because for instance, with electricity, you have to have an electric grid. And you have to have all the wires set up that are running all around. And then you've got generating stations that are putting power onto that grid. So you have power on that grid. And then what you have to do is maybe just connect different houses or businesses to that grid. So you have to have a huge cost of building this grid and building the power stations to be able to have power on the grid, but then a relatively low cost of connecting an extra house or an extra user to that grid, and then a relatively low cost of actually generating additional electricity. After you've built the power plants, it really doesn't, though those power plants are geared up to produce a large quantity of electricity, and so you have to have power out on the grid, whether to have one power plant out there powering a grid, you've got a lot of power out there. So it's actually, again, another case where we have these very large first unit costs. And so it sort of looks like a fixed cost, but it's not really a fixed cost, but it's going to give us this, it's one of the reasons why we would see this declining average total cost curve. And so a lot of cases where we think about what we call public utilities, they're going to have this natural monopolistic pattern to them. So why is it natural monopoly? Why are we calling it natural monopoly as opposed to just regular old-fashioned monopoly? Well, it turns out there's two reasons why we would call that natural monopoly. first off would be, if we had an industry where we have a cost curve for all of the firms had access to the same technology, they all had the same similar cost curve. If we had a whole bunch of firms in this industry, and let's suppose that they were all small at one point in time, so we come in 2024 and we observe a bunch of small firms operating up here on this, at this point on the average total cost curve. And they're all about the same size, so they have the same cost. Oh, and I don't know if that's even visible, so I tried to do green there. Here's some red, a little easier to see. So we're trying to, we have a whole bunch of small firms operating in this industry. They have about the same cost. But now let's imagine, let's suppose over time, one of these businesses gets to be a little bit bigger than the other. If you've got a bunch of firms and they all start here with about the same level of high cost, if one of them gets a little bit bigger than the other, maybe two of them merge, maybe one of them comes up with a nice advertising campaign, maybe they have growth for one reason or another. If one of these firms grows, they get to move down this average total cost curve. That means their cost per unit falls. That means that they could lower their price and still break even. So as one firm gets a little bit larger, they can lower their price. And if this product is, say, a homogeneous product from the consumer standpoint, well, consumers will start flocking to the one that offers the lower price. So if one firm gets a little bit bigger, they now have lower costs, they can offer lower price. That's going to allow them to get even bigger. That means even lower costs, and then lower costs and lower costs. So if we had started, say, in 2024 with, like, say, 10 or 12 firms all operating up here at this point, and we came back in 5 or 10 years, it would not be surprising at all if we saw only a single firm operating in this industry, because one of them got to be bigger than the others and is now able to supply the whole quantity for the market, because they have a lower cost. So once a firm gets bigger here, they have a cost advantage over the others, and that allows them to lower their price and puts the other companies in an untenable situation. You either have to lower your price even though you have higher costs to try to match the price cut, but if you do that, then you lose money on every unit you sell, or you try to maintain your higher price to cover costs, in which case you're not competitive on the price. So there's really strong reasons to think that over time we would expect to see one firm come to dominate this market, and they could hold a monopoly position in this market. Another reason to think that this is a natural monopoly is that it turns out in an industry like this, whatever quantity we want to have produced, the cheapest way to have any quantity produced, given this declining average total cost curve, would be to have one firm produce it. We want one firm to produce this entire quantity, whatever it happens to be. We will use fewer resources if we do that. And again, that just follows from the downward sloping shape of the average total cost curve. So suppose we have Q here, and then as an alternative, let's take Q over 2, and then say, well, at a quantity of Q, if we want Q units produced, here's our cost per unit. And then this rectangle would give us the amount of the cost, the value of the resources that would be required to produce this Q units. Let's alternatively say, let's have two firms each producing half of the amount. Well, their costs per unit are going to be higher. Each firm would have an area of costs given by the rectangle here. And then the thing to remember is that you've got two of these. So really to sort of compare the two, you need to have two of these rectangles to match this. And so it would be as if you were extending this out here. And you could see here then that this rectangle that corresponds to the height of the one at Q over 2, this rectangle is much bigger than the rectangle we have down here. We would use more resources to produce any given amount. If we want to minimize the cost of producing a given amount of the output, we would want to have one firm produce this total amount of the good. So that's the reasons why, is what the explanation, we have these first unit costs that lead to this economies of scale and production, and then we have, for these two reasons, monopoly ends up being natural. We have both a tendency toward monopoly in this industry, and it turns out that a single firm producing this good would be efficient. I'm going to make another video here to talk about how we might go about regulating such a natural monopoly.